My son-in-law laughed when the moving truck pulled away. I was standing on the front step of the house I had shared with my husband for 31 years, holding a cardboard box that contained a photo album, 2 coffee mugs, my reading glasses, and a card my granddaughter had made me for my birthday. He stood in the driveway with his arms crossed and said, "You didn't really think you'd get to stay, did you?" And then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly. Something worse, a dismissive one, like I was a small inconvenience that had finally been resolved. I was 68 years old. I had nowhere to go. My husband Raymond had died 11 months before that. A heart attack, sudden, on a Tuesday morning in March when the snow was still thick on the ground in Sudbury. We had been married for 31 years. Not perfect years. No marriage has those, but good ones, mostly. He was a stubborn man who forgot anniversaries and made excellent chili and always, always kissed me on the forehead before he left for work. I didn't know, until he was gone, how much I had organized my whole life around that small gesture. Raymond had 2 children from his first marriage. His son, whose name I will not use here because I have made peace with what happened, and using his name pulls it back open, and a daughter named Celeste who lived in Calgary and called on holidays. I had tried over the years to build something with both of them. I had not always succeeded. Raymond's son had never fully accepted me, and after Raymond died, it became clear he had been waiting a long time for me to be gone. The house was in Raymond's name. I had known this, vaguely, the way you know things you don't want to examine too closely. We had talked, years ago, about updating the will, about making things official and clean. Raymond had said we'd get to it. We never got to it. And when he died without an updated will, the house passed to his estate, and his estate passed to his children, and his son moved quickly, and his lawyer moved quickly, and his lawyer moved quickly, and I was given 60 days to vacate. I did not fight it. I didn't have the money to fight it, and I didn't have the energy. And part of me, the part that had just watched the man I loved be lowered into frozen ground, simply couldn't locate the will to argue about square footage and property titles. I packed my boxes. I arranged for a storage unit on Elm Street. I moved into a room I rented from a woman named Audrey who had 3 cats and kept the heat very low and charged me $800 a month, which was what I could afford on my pension and the small amount Raymond had left me in savings. That first winter was the hardest thing I have ever done. I had worked most of my life as a school secretary, 32 years at the same elementary school in Sudbury, watching children grow up, knowing their parents by name, keeping track of 600 small lives with a filing system I had built myself and a kettle that I kept on my desk. I had retired at 65. I had imagined that retirement would mean mornings with Raymond, coffee on the back porch when the weather allowed, maybe some travel once we got around to it. We had talked about Prince Edward Island. We had talked about a train trip out west. Now I was in a room that smelled like cat and someone else's laundry detergent, eating toast for dinner because I wasn't hungry. And the kitchen was Audrey's kitchen, and I felt like a guest in a place that wasn't a home. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself that at 68 I was not finished. I had seen women come back from worse. I believed it some mornings and not others. It was Celeste who called me in February. She had heard, through some family channel I wasn't part of anymore, that I had moved out. She was sorry, she said. She wished she had known sooner. She had 2 young children and a job that left her little room, and she lived in Calgary, which was very far from Sudbury. And she said all of this in a voice that was genuinely apologetic. I told her I was fine. I told her I was managing. I believed neither thing entirely, but I meant well by both of them. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my rented bed and looked out the window at the February street and thought, I am 68 years old and I am starting over. I don't know how to do that. I don't know if I am capable of that. Then I made myself a cup of tea on Audrey's kettle, which she had told me I was welcome to use, and I decided that not knowing how to do something had never stopped me before, and it would not stop me now. I had learned to drive at 42. I had learned to use a computer at 50. I had outlasted a great many things that had seemed impossible at the time. The call came on a Thursday in April. I almost didn't answer it. I didn't recognize the number, a Toronto area code, and I had been getting calls from a company trying to extend my car warranty, which I did not have, and I was tired of them. But something made me pick up. The woman on the other end introduced herself as a solicitor with a firm in Toronto. She asked if I was June Hartwell. I said I was. She asked if I had been previously married to a man named Stuart Ashby in 1979 in Kitchener, Ontario. I sat down on the nearest chair. Stuart. I had not heard that name spoken aloud in, it must have been 15 years. Longer, maybe. We had been married for 2 years, Stuart and I, when I was 23 and 24, and very young and very certain that love was enough to hold two people together. It wasn't, or at least it wasn't enough to hold us. We had no children. We had no house. We had a small apartment on Duke Street and a disagreement about what kind of life we were each trying to build, and eventually we had a quiet, undramatic divorce, and I had gone back to my maiden name and moved back to Sudbury, where my mother still lived, and started the life I actually ended up living. I'd heard some years later through an old acquaintance that Stuart had moved to British Columbia. After that, nothing. I had not looked for him. I had not needed to. Yes, I told the solicitor. I was married to Stuart Ashby. We divorced in 1981. I see, she said. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm calling because Mr. Ashby passed away in November. He had no children and no living immediate family. He left a will. She paused in the way that people pause when they are about to say something that will rearrange the room. He left the majority of his estate to you. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a car went by on the slushy street. One of Audrey's cats walked into the room and looked at me without interest and walked back out. I'm sorry, I said. I don't understand. We were divorced 40 years ago. Yes, the solicitor said. The will is explicit on that point. Mr. Ashby was aware of the length of time. He left documentation explaining his wishes. She paused again. There are conditions attached to receiving the estate, Mrs. Hartwell. We would need to verify your identity formally, confirm your original marriage documentation, and have you participate in a probate proceeding here in Toronto. There's also the matter of a contestation that has been filed. A contestation, I repeated. Yes, Mr. Ashby had a business partner of many years. He has filed a challenge to the will, claiming that Mr. Ashby was not of sound mind when the document was signed. I pressed my hand flat against the kitchen table. Steady, I told myself. Just stay steady. How much? I asked, and then felt immediately ashamed for asking. The solicitor told me. I wrote the number down on the back of an envelope that had been sitting on the table, an old hydro bill, and I stared at it for a long time after we hung up. Stuart Ashby had done well for himself. He had built a small construction and property management company in Kelowna. He had lived quietly and spent carefully and apparently kept a great deal. The estate, after taxes and fees, would come to somewhere in the range of $2.8 million. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I called Celeste, not to tell her about the money. I wasn't ready for that, and I needed to understand what was real before I said it out loud. I called her because she was a lawyer. Civil litigation, mostly, but she knew how these things worked in a general way, and she was the only person in my life at that moment who had both the knowledge and the disposition to help me think clearly. What do I do first? I asked her, after I had explained as much as I understood. You get your own legal representation in Toronto, she said immediately. Don't use the estate's lawyers. They represent the estate, not you personally. And you need to find your original marriage certificate. Do you have it? I did. It was in a box in the Elm Street storage unit, in a folder I had labeled Important Documents in 1987 and never sorted through since. It had followed me from apartment to apartment and finally into the house with Raymond, and now into a storage unit, the small folder of the legal evidence of my life. I drove to the storage unit the next morning. It took me 40 minutes to find the folder. The certificate was there, slightly yellowed at the edges, with both our signatures in the careful handwriting of people in their 20s who believed the documents they were signing were permanent. I held it in the cold of the storage unit and thought about Stuart. Not with romance. That had been over so long ago it barely registered as a feeling anymore, but with something more like quiet bewilderment. Why me? After 40 years in a whole separate life, why had he looked backward and found my name? There was a letter. The solicitor had mentioned it, but I hadn't quite understood until she mailed it to me. An actual posted letter, the way things were done once. It was in Stuart's handwriting, which I barely remembered and then recognized immediately, the particular loop of his lowercase g's. He wrote that he had never had children, which he had not regretted, but that near the end he had found himself thinking about the people who had mattered to him in his life, and that I had mattered, not in a dramatic way. He wrote, "You were kind to me when I didn't deserve it, and I've always thought that counted for something." He had tried to find a next of kin and hadn't. He had thought about charities and hadn't been able to decide. He had landed, in the end, on me. "There is no condition other than this," he wrote, "that you use some portion of it to do something you have always wanted to do and never done. I leave the definition of that entirely to you." I read the letter twice in Audrey's kitchen while her cats walked around my feet. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in its envelope and set it on top of the important documents folder. The contestation was filed by a man named Derek Pollock, who had been Stuart's business partner for 18 years. He claimed through his lawyers that Stuart had shown signs of cognitive decline in his final year and had been unduly influenced in drawing up his will. He submitted an affidavit from a former employee who stated that Stuart had seemed confused at a company meeting 8 months before his death. What Derek Pollock did not know, or perhaps knew and hoped I didn't, was that Stuart had been meticulous. The solicitor, as she walked me through the file, noted that Stuart had undergone a formal capacity assessment 6 weeks before signing the will, conducted by a geriatric psychiatrist at a Kelowna clinic. The assessment was thorough and documented and found no impairment. Stuart had also, on the advice of his solicitor, recorded a video statement the day he signed the will, speaking calmly and in detail about his wishes and his reasoning. He had known someone might challenge it. He had prepared accordingly. My Toronto lawyer, a woman named Joan, recommended to me by Celeste, said after reviewing everything that Derek Pollock's contestation was aggressive but thin. "He's hoping you'll settle," she told me during our second call. "He's hoping you don't have the resources to fight it and that a smaller payout looks better to you than a longer process." "It doesn't," I said. "Good," Joan said, and I could hear something like approval in her voice. What I didn't know until Joan told me in our third call was that Derek Pollock had also taken steps that crossed from aggressive into something else entirely. He had hired a private investigator who had contacted my former daughter-in-law, Raymond's son's ex-wife, with whom I had remained friendly, and asked questions about my mental health and my financial history. The investigator had also, apparently, obtained the email address I used and sent a message purporting to be from Joan's firm, asking me to send copies of personal documents to an address that was not Joan's firm. I had received that email. I had thought it was strange. The wording was slightly off and the address domain didn't match what Joan had given me, and I had called Joan directly rather than responding. Joan had, in her calm and thorough way, reported this to the Law Society of Ontario and added it to the file. "He has made a significant mistake," Joan said. "Yes," I said, "he has." The probate hearing was held in Toronto on a Tuesday in June. I took the train down from Sudbury the day before and stayed in a hotel near Union Station, a modest one, a comfort inn, because I was not yet in the habit of spending money I didn't formally have. I ordered room service, a club sandwich and a pot of tea, and I sat by the window and watched the evening come down over the city and thought about the last time I had been in Toronto. Raymond and I had come for a weekend, years ago. We had seen a show at the Princess of Wales Theatre, something musical that I had enjoyed and he had tolerated good-naturedly. He had bought me a small silver pin at a shop on King Street. I still had it somewhere in the storage unit. The hearing itself was quieter than I had expected. Joan had told me it would be procedural, and it was. I sat at a table and answered questions and presented my documentation and watched Derek Pollock's lawyer make arguments that Joan had already methodically anticipated and dismantled in the paperwork submitted beforehand. When the opposing lawyer mentioned the employee affidavit about cognitive decline, Joan produced the capacity assessment. When he suggested Stewart might have been confused about the extent of his estate, Joan produced 3 years of audited financial statements. When he implied that Stewart and I had been in contact recently and that there might be undue influence from my side, an implication so thin it was nearly transparent, Joan noted that she had records of all correspondence and that there was none between myself and Mr. Corden Ashby in the 20 years prior to his death. Derek Pollock sat at the other table in a good suit and did not look at me once. The decision was not immediate. These things take time, but Joan called me 6 weeks later on a Wednesday morning when I was in the middle of making porridge. "It's done," she said. "The contestation has been dismissed. The estate proceeds to you." I turned off the burner. I stood in Audrey's kitchen, which still smelled like cat, and I let myself feel it fully for exactly 1 minute. The relief and the strangeness and the grief that was still underneath everything, because none of this brought Raymond back, and none of it changed what his son had done. And I was still 68 years old and still starting over, just doing it now with resources I hadn't had before. 1 minute. Then I picked up the phone and called Celeste. She cried a little. I didn't, but I came close. The first thing I did, once the money was in my account and the numbers stopped feeling like something I had imagined, was call my youngest niece. Her name is Wendy, and she is 34, and she has been raising her son alone since her partner left 3 years ago, working as a personal support worker in a community that has very few of them. I had watched Wendy struggle in the quiet way that people who are too proud to ask for help always struggle, doing without, putting things off, sleeping badly and not saying why. I transferred enough money to clear her car loan and her credit card debt, which she had mentioned only once in passing and which I had remembered. I did not make a production of it. I sent her a note that said only, "Use this, you've earned rest." She called me and cried for 7 minutes. I timed it on the microwave clock because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The second thing I did was find an apartment. A proper one, with my name on the lease, on a street in Sudbury that I knew and liked. 2 bedrooms because I finally had books that deserved shelves, and a small balcony that caught the afternoon light. I thanked Audrey, who had been perfectly decent to me, and I moved in on a Saturday in September with the help of a moving company and my own 2 hands, and a sense that I was, for the first time in almost 2 years, inhabiting a space that was mine. I did not tell Raymond's son about any of it. I saw no reason to. He had done what he had done, and the law had allowed it, and I had made my peace with that. Not easily, and not completely, but enough to go forward. He did not cross my mind when I signed my lease. He did not cross my mind when I arranged my books on their shelves, or hung the painting I had kept in storage for 18 months because there had been nowhere to put it. He had made himself irrelevant to my life, and I allowed him that. The things Stewart had asked me to do, something I had always wanted to do and never done, took me some months to identify. Not because I didn't have the list. I had the list. I had been adding to it quietly for 40 years. Travel, yes. Prince Edward Island, still. A proper kitchen with a good stove, which I now had. Time to read without guilt. But what I landed on, when I was honest with myself, was simpler and more specific than any of those things. I had spent 32 years keeping track of children whose names I knew, but whose lives I could only glimpse. I had always, in the background of those years, wanted to work more directly with kids who were struggling, reading difficulties, mostly, which I had some informal knowledge of from decades of watching and asking and paying attention. I had never pursued it properly. There had always been a reason not to. That fall, I enrolled in a literacy tutoring certification program through Laurentian University. It was not expensive. It was not glamorous. It was 3 evenings a week and a practicum placement and a great deal of reading about reading. I was the oldest person in the program by about 30 years. This turned out not to matter in the way I had feared it would. There's a boy I work with now, on Wednesday afternoons at the public library on Mackenzie Street. He is 8 years old and he finds letters genuinely difficult, in the specific way that certain brains find them difficult. And he has developed, as children in that position do, a very convincing performance of not caring about reading because it has been less painful to pretend not to care than to keep trying and failing. I know this performance. I watched it for 3 decades in a school office. I know what it costs. We have been working together since January. Last week he read a full page to me without stopping. He looked up when he finished, checking my face the way kids do when they aren't sure yet whether to let themselves feel proud. I told him he had just done something hard and done it well. He looked back down at the book, but he was smiling. I kept the letters Stuart wrote me. It's in the imperfect documents folder now, filed between the marriage certificate and the papers from the probate proceeding. Sometimes I take it out and read the line again. You were kind to me when I didn't deserve it, and I've always thought that counted for something. I think about what it means to matter to someone quietly, over a long distance of years, in a way neither of you is fully aware of while it's happening. I think about the ways we move through other people's lives and don't always know what we've left behind. I am 69 now. I live in an apartment with good light and too many books and a balcony where I drink my coffee in the mornings when the weather allows. Last summer, I finally went to Prince Edward Island, alone, which I had thought would feel like a consolation prize and turned out to feel like a gift. I drove along the North Shore in a rented car with the windows down and the red clay cliffs going by on one side and the Gulf on the other, and I thought, Raymond would have loved this. And then, I love this. Both things were true. Both things fit. I had not expected, at 68 with a cardboard box in my hands and a man laughing at my back, that 69 would feel like beginning. I had not known that was still possible. I know it now. I still think about the moment I stood on that front step with a cardboard box in my hands, 2 coffee mugs, a photo album, my reading glasses. That was what 31 years had been reduced to in the eyes of a man who had been waiting patiently for me to become someone else's problem. What I've come to understand, not quickly and not without cost, is that what happens to us is rarely the whole story. The whole story includes what we do next. It includes whether we let the cruelty of one moment define the shape of every moment that follows. Raymond's son acted without decency. That is simply true. He had the legal right to do what he did, and he exercised it without a day's hesitation. And I spent a winter in a rented room with low heat and someone else's cats, and I will not pretend that didn't leave a mark. It did, but a mark is not a verdict. Stuart, on the other hand, a man I had not spoken to in 40 years, a man I had nearly forgotten the sound of, had spent his final months thinking carefully about who had mattered to him and why, and had done something precise and considered and generous. He had kept records. He had anticipated challenges. He had written a letter by hand. When Derek Pollock tried to use confusion and pressure and legal aggression to take what Stuart had clearly intended, it didn't work. Not because the universe intervened, but because Stuart had been thorough and because I had been careful. And because Joan was better at her job than Derek's lawyers had counted on. That's the part I keep coming back to. Doing things properly. Thinking ahead. Not assuming that goodwill is enough without documentation, or that trust is a substitute for clarity. I had learned that lesson the hard way with Raymond's house. No updated will, no protection, 60 days to vacate. I did not make the same mistake again. When Joan told me what to gather and how to respond, I listened exactly and moved quickly and kept records of everything. The outcome was not luck. It was the result of people behaving with competence and care under pressure. And then there is Wendy. I think about her often, the way she had been carrying that debt quietly, working her shifts, putting her son to bed, never once saying the word help directly, because she had learned somewhere along the way that asking was a kind of failure. When I cleared that debt, I wasn't doing her a favor in the way people mean when they talk about charity. I was correcting an imbalance that shouldn't have existed in the first place. She had been working harder than most people I know for less than she deserved, and she had kept going anyway. That kind of persistence deserves to be met with something real. I think the three things that carried me through this, and that I see in everyone who has come through something genuinely hard, are simpler than they sound. The first is acting with integrity, even when no one is watching and there is nothing to gain by it. Stuart did this for 40 years in a small city in British Columbia, and it changed my life. The second is thinking clearly when everything is uncertain, gathering the right information, asking the right questions, not letting fear make you careless. And the third is simply refusing to stop. Not dramatically, just continuing. Eating the toast, making the tea, driving to the storage unit, answering the phone. I didn't know, when I was standing on that step, that 68 was not an ending. I know it now. And that, I think, is worth saying out loud.